Those of you who know me know this. I love the Bible. Just when I think there's nothing new in this Bible passage because I've read it over and over and over again and there's just nothing new, well, then I spend a little more time with it and I study it in more depth, and all of a sudden new insights pop out. And I experienced a lot of that as I worked through this passage from Genesis. So today, we're just going to work through that Bible passage and see what it has to say to us today. It begins with the birth of Cain, who, like his dad Adam, was a tiller of the ground, a farmer. Following Cain, his younger brother Abel was born, and he raised sheep. He was a rancher. Now, they appear to have been a faithful family, for both of them bring an offering to God. Now, just to be clear, it's not an offering for sin. It's just an offering of thanks, of well-being. Things are going well, and I'm grateful. But it says Cain brought an offering of the fruit of the ground. But Abel brought the firstlings of his flock, their fat portions, as an offering. Now, the story really isn't explicit as to why, but God preferred Abel's offering to Cain's, and there has been an awful lot of ink that has been spilt trying to clarify why that is. Some scholars think, well, it's just because God prefers animal offerings to plant offerings. Other scholars think that God simply prefers the younger son. And we see that in the book of Genesis. Because remember the story of Jacob and Esau? Esau's the older brother, but Jacob is the one who receives the blessing. He's the one who has his name changed to Israel as the father then of the nation of Israel. Or a little bit further toward the end of the book of Genesis, we have that story of Joseph and his 10 older brothers and the conflicts that they have. So I lean toward thinking that the difference lies in the quality of the offering. The text says simply that Cain brought an offering from the ground. Abel, however, brings the firstlings of his flock and their fat. Now, later in the Jewish law of the Old Testament, we're told that if the faithful are bringing an offering to God from their flock or from their herd, it should be the firstlings, the firstborns that are offered. And especially the fat, because apparently God likes it when you burn the fat. It smells really good, apparently. And Abel has done that. Abel has brought the firstlings, the firstborns, brought the fat. But also in the Jewish law, if one is bringing an offering of the ground, if someone is bringing the fruit of the ground, it has to be the first fruits. And Cain has not done that. He has simply brought an offering. Now, scholars who don't like that interpretation, they'll say, yeah, but the Jewish law hadn't been given by God yet. But I kind of think that misses the point, and this is why. We forget that Genesis is law. The book of Genesis is law. Often I think when we hear the Torah, the Jewish law, we think of the 613 do's and don'ts that we find in those first 5 books of the Bible. But that's not all of the law. The law is the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. So even the stories that we find in these books are law. These stories give us insight into how following the law actually looks. So on one hand, I think this story shows us what it looks like to follow the law by bringing our best to God and not just our leftovers. But maybe there's more that this story can offer us. Maybe there's more that this story can teach us about living in covenant relationship with God and with one another. But back to the story. God did not appreciate Cain's offering, and Cain was angry. But God asked Cain, "Why are you angry, and why has your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is looking at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Now, I'll admit that I have typically interpreted this statement something like this. Next time you give an offering, Cain, do better. But if you don't do better, you're sinful. Well, maybe that's the case. But is there something deeper there? A few scholars I read wondered something like this. What if God is saying, Cain, I see that you're angry, and you have a choice to make now. How will you use your anger? If you use your anger well, you'll be accepted. But if you don't use your anger well, sin will have pounced on you. But there's a bit of hope because God commands Cain to control this lurking sin, and surely God would not command us to do something that we are unable to do. But what if what God is saying in Genesis is something like what Barbara read to us from Ephesians? Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not make room for the devil. Do not make room for sin that is lurking at the door, ready to pounce. I'll admit, as I see what happens next in the story, I think this second interpretation is quite fitting, for we see what Cain does with his anger. Something strikes me here. Why in the world is Cain mad at God? Why is Cain mad at Abel? Shouldn't Cain be mad at God? God is the one who didn't like Cain's offering. It's not Abel's fault that God didn't like Cain's offering. But like we so often do as humans, we blame others for our problems, don't we? We seek to scapegoat someone else and punish them when things don't go the way we want. And so Cain invited Abel out into the field and killed him, taking his revenge out on someone who had done nothing to him. Then God asked Cain, "Where's your brother Abel?" "I do not know," Cain responded. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Cain has refused to take responsibility for his brother, his own family. "What have you done?" God asked, and then declared, "Listen, your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground." Now, I think it's worthwhile noting that the Hebrew word that's translated crying here is the very same word that we see throughout the Old Testament anytime the oppressed people will cry out for help. Abel has certainly been oppressed, hasn't he? But I also think it's interesting to consider that the Jewish law will provide for punishment. It will say an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a life for a life. Now, centuries later, Jesus will counter that. He'll say, "You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not violently resist an evildoer. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also." But long before that, in our passage from Genesis today, we see a picture of a God who wants to end the cycle of violence. Because God is not willing to exact life for life, even though that's what Cain deserves. And so God simply continues saying that the ground is now cursed because of Abel's blood. Cain will no longer be able to earn his living by the one thing he knows how to do. Rather, he's going to have to walk and wander around the earth. As the story continues, Cain lamented the consequences of his actions. But he also realized that even though God had chosen not to exact life for life, someone else is likely to do so. The cycle of violence will still continue against him. But here's a beautiful part of the story. God is still committed to Cain even in his sin. And God promised that this will not happen. Now, for sure, the text says that God promised vengeance for anyone who would kill Cain. But notice, God puts a mark or a sign on Cain to prevent that from happening. Clearly, God wants to stop the cycle of violence. But what is this mark or this sign that is put on Cain? Well, there's also been an awful lot of ink spilled about that, trying to make speculations about what that means. Was it a tattoo? Was it a scar? Was it something he was supposed to wear? Was it on his forehead? Was it on his face? Did it just make him look hideous, thus scaring any would-be attackers? But to me, all this speculation and questioning misses the point. And this is why. Because at its most basic, this sign is grace given to Cain by God. Cain does not deserve this. But God gave this free gift anyway, and thus it is grace. So whatever this mark or sign was, it is a sign of God's grace. Now, a sign is outward and visible, but it points to an inward and spiritual grace. Now, too often I think we understand God's grace as something that is external to us. We think of God's grace as simply a change in our status before God. But for us as United Methodists, we have a deeper understanding of grace. Grace works in us. Grace doesn't just change our status. Grace affects real change in us. Grace empowers us to be better. Grace empowers us to do better. So what if what others saw on Cain was not some literal mark? What if what others saw in Cain was a change in demeanor? What if what others saw in Cain was a change in how he treated others? For me, one of the key points of this story of Cain and Abel is Cain's question to God. Am I my brother's keeper? Now, I'm convinced that the authors and compilers of the book of Genesis use that as a rhetorical question to guide the rest of the book, this book of Jewish law. Just think of this. I already mentioned Jacob and Esau. Jacob cheated Esau out of his birthright, out of his blessing, and he wants revenge. But they ultimately reconcile. They support one another. They become each other's keepers. Or consider the story of Joseph and his brothers. His brothers have sold him off into slavery, and when Joseph comes upon them, he contemplates revenge. He has the power to do it. But ultimately, he reconciles. He provides for his brothers. He becomes their keepers. But I encourage you to sit down and read through the book of Genesis and notice this. That anytime you see people not looking out for the needs of others, and this is anybody, not just siblings, they tend to fail. But when people in the book of Exodus care for the needs of others, they succeed. So I'm convinced that part of the law that we find in Genesis is that truly we are to be our siblings' keepers. And not just our literal siblings, but all of God's children. Cain asked, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Obviously, Cain chose not to be Abel's keeper. Cain could not see the importance of caring for others until he lost his own source of livelihood. Cain could not see the importance of caring for others until he was forced to rely on others who would need to be his keeper in order for him to even survive. Cain could not see the importance of caring for others until he encountered God's grace. And I think this is the part of the story of Cain that we overlook. Because after this encounter with God's grace, Cain finds himself in the land of Nod. Now, Nod is literally just wandering, so it's just a place of wandering. But as he wanders, he has to figure out how to survive. But what happens next? He found a wife. They had a child. They named him Enoch. And then what does Cain do? Cain builds a city. Cain builds a community. And a community is where you have to figure out how to live together. A community is where you'll have to find ways to care for one another. And so I think in the end, Cain realizes that yes, he truly is his sibling's keeper. And that reminds me then of our passage from Ephesians that Barbara read earlier. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children. As I think of our story from Genesis, a book of the law, I see an invitation to imitate God, to do all in our power to stop that ongoing cycle of violence, to not seek retribution, but to offer transforming grace instead. I see an invitation to imitate God, to be keepers of one another. For all of us are God's children, and because of that, we are all siblings one of another. But I love how that passage from Ephesians continues. Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. I envision in the story of Cain that as he walked and he wandered with God's grace now, that he finally realized the need to love. He finally realized that he needed to give for the good of others. He finally realized he needed to sacrifice to help others. So friends, as we wander through life together, may we seek to imitate God. May we walk in love as Christ did, not seeking vengeance, but helping all, even our enemies, even ourselves. May we walk in love as Christ did, knowing and sharing the transforming grace of God, being willing to sacrifice for the good of others. And because of God's grace, we can do that. Thanks be to God. Amen.